Wow! Where do I begin? I'm writing you this letter a few weeks into my journey. As I stare out towards the ocean with the blistering hot sun streaming onto my warm fur. You see, 2 weeks ago I found myself washed up on the shores of Africa. I was lying there all alone with jagged rocks poking my back and furry legs when a giant wave rushed over me, causing me to shoot up in absolute panic. As I spat out the salty sea water from my mouth and wiped my big brown eyes, I wondered to myself, how did I get here? And where on earth have I come from? As I crawled to safety onto some dry rocks nearby, I began to look around. I was surrounded by cliff edges and huge ocean waves drawing in closer and closer. The sun hadn't risen yet, and I sat in absolute fear, not knowing what lay ahead of me. At this point, I gave myself 2 options. I could sit and wait for help, or I could choose to be brave and explore what lay ahead of me. The wind was howling, and I could barely hear myself think. Suddenly, I saw a small light flickering at the top of a rocky cliff. Could this be a sign? I slowly stood up, picked up the only item I had with me, my trusty brown hat, and began my journey towards the small light. I used my claws to climb up the rocks, with my shaky arms pulling me up bit by bit. By this point, my big bare belly was grumbling so loud I'm sure it could be heard by the ships in the distance. After what felt like 1,000,000 hours, the light I'd seen was getting dimmer and dimmer, until it was no longer in sight. Had I imagined it this whole time? I was in absolute despair, until the next minute my trusty brown hat flew right off my head with a gust of wind so strong that it nearly took me straight off my feet. Knowing this was all I owned, I started chasing after it, running as fast as I possibly could. Suddenly, it stopped. Just like that. In the middle of nowhere. It was quite peculiar. The wind was still howling, and still no movement from the hat. It just lay there as though it was trying to tell me something. I grabbed it as quickly as possible and secured it tightly to my head, making sure not to lose it again. As I looked up, I saw that right in front of me lay a perfectly paved path. A path towards the light. It was a lighthouse. With a spring in my step, I continued ahead, constantly thanking my dear hat for saving the day. My very first encounter was with the lighthouse keeper, a wonderful man by the name of Kirby. I'll never forget him. He was standing, looking out over the ocean, watching the sun rise in front of him. Without even saying hello, he looked at me and said, "You know, I've not missed a single sunrise in my 30 years of working here, and not a single one has looked the same." His smile was as wide as the ocean, with teeth too few to count. But that didn't bother him. He was warm and kind, and had the most wonderful qualities that helped calm my nerves during this very scary time. He offered me a cup of hot rooibos tea and the most delicious gigantic biscuit called a rusk, apparently a famous local favourite. Without any judgment or questioning, Kirby filled me in on some essential knowledge that I would need to know if I was ever going to explore further into the world. He told me which country I was in, the time of year, the exact date, and our specific location. What he couldn't tell me was where I might have come from, my name, and what on earth I was doing here. Kirby could sense my worry, and so we sat together on a bench just below the lighthouse, watching the sun rise up over our heads with the sound of birds and ocean waves filling the air. "What am I going to do, Kirby?" I asked in a very shaky voice. "Where do I go from here?" "Oh, Mr. Bear, the world's your oyster, and you can make of it what you want. Just look at the beauty right in front of you. Right now, you're sitting at Cape Point in South Africa. It's in this region that we have a meeting point of two oceans, the Atlantic and the Indian." Suddenly, Kirby jumped off his seat and shouted, "Goodness me, I don't believe it! Mr. Bear! Look, Mr. Bear! Can you see it? I think it might be a southern right whale." Kirby sprinted into the lighthouse and hurried back with a pair of binoculars. "Now, you really should get a pair of these, Mr. Bear, especially if you are off to explore the world." He handed me the binoculars and started to tell me all about this beautiful sea creature. "These whales are known to swim nearby," Kirby said, "and they love to jump like we're seeing now. If we were a little bit closer, we'd even be able to hear the big crash each time the whale's body hit the water. Do you know, there aren't many of these creatures left because they've been known as the right whale to hunt by humans. Oh, that's awful, I know." The next moment, there was silence. Well, I asked Kirby what was wrong. "Oh, I'm probably boring you. I'm sorry, Mr. Bear. I just don't get to talk to many people out here." I gasped. "Oh, goodness me, Kirby, please don't stop. I'm not sure I've ever spoken to a single person in my entire life. Please, go on." And so he continued, telling me about how the whales live for up to 200 years, how they grow up to 18 meters long, and how they swim ever so slowly with their mouths wide open, eating fish all day long. Oh, hang on. Let's go back to that. Imagine being 18 meters long. I tell you what, fellow adventurers, why don't you take 18 big hops forward, and then you'll see how big these whales can get." As I sat listening to Kirby, I realized there was so much more to learn about people, cultures, places, and our planet. So right then and there, I decided I would travel the world and write to my fellow adventurers, just like you, to share my experiences and stories. 3 hours later, with my belly now paining from all the delicious rusks, Kirby shouted, "Quick, Mr. Bear, they're here." Kirby advised that I get onto one of the famous red hop-on, hop-off buses that takes you around the nearby South African city, Cape Town. "You'll be sure to meet some interesting people and see some incredible places," explained Kirby. Boy, was I nervous. But I was so grateful for having met Kirby. I gave him the biggest squeeze and said my goodbyes. I ran down the wobbly stone path as fast as my little legs could take me, and as I grabbed the rail to pull myself up onto the bus, I heard Kirby shout, "Never stop learning, and never stop exploring, Mr. Bear." I tipped my trusty brown hat, jumped on board, and got ready for an adventure that would last a lifetime. I can't wait to share my next adventure with you, my little explorers. But I have one favor to ask. Please help me complete the secret mission on the Kids Collab portal that will help me on this journey.